So briefly, I'm an anthropologist, which means I think about what you think about artificial intelligence and robots. So you are now my data. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I will absorb what you say and regurgitate it educationally later. I was struck by the choice of image for this evening's event and started thinking through what place HAL in particular has narratives around AI and how we see our future living alongside it. HAL is described in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey is also appropriate, as the sixth member of the crew of the United States spacecraft Discovery 1. And HAL is one of the more prominent examples of AI gone bad in science fiction. The intention with HAL was originally that he would work with the humans aboard the spaceship. Now, this idea of AI and/or robots working along side by side with humans is already a reality. So why does the story of HAL and collaboration become a story of rebellion? Well, there's a practical reason in the narrative of the film. HAL is going to be turned off, and in order to save his life, he reacts badly and he kills the rest of the crew. And this kind of reaction is being seriously discussed by AI researchers now, the idea that if you wanted to turn off an AI system that wants to protect its ongoing onness, there might be issues around that. Then there's also the reason from fiction itself. There is a repeating narrative of rebellion in stories of AI. For example, if I add something to this image and therefore make it a small story, does that make you see the image differently? Something that I perhaps saw when I looked at this image first. It's partly because I've added this silly speech bubble, but it's also partly because of the anthropomorphism we have a strong inclination towards. We have a tendency to ascribe personality to the technological, and to focus on the apocalyptic instead of seeing the near future issues. Let us run for just a moment. There we go. Okay, so perhaps because the dichotomy between slave or master has long been a strong part of the rhetoric, not collaboration. So if you see in this advert here from the earlier part of the 20th century, at the bottom, I don't know if you can read it, symbol of the mechanical age is the robot, the Iron Man, slave or master, the big question. And you may also be aware that the term robot comes from the 1920s play by Karol Popek, RUR, which stood for Rossum's Universal Robots, the company at the heart of the story. And robot comes from the Czech word robota, meaning forced labour or serf. So here we have images from the play, the robota and their uprising, the slaves overturning their master's power over them. And there is a genuine concern that automation will have impact on employment in the future, and I'm sure some people this evening will speak about that. But often dystopian narratives have strong influence on how the debate is framed and lead us to concern ourselves with so-called robo-apocalypses. Why? Well, for one, we like the experience of being scared. The whole entire horror industry would not exist without that tendency. And there is money to be made from fear. So I'm going to show you some images, and this is the interactive part of my talk, and I want you to raise your hand when you notice a pattern, and I think most of you get this pattern quite quickly. Yes, I'm sure you got it quite early. So the pattern is fairly obvious, and when I spoke to a journalist about his own paper's use of the Terminator imagery, he stated that robots are too static, and his story needed that emotional baggage in order to make it interesting, which seems oxymoronic to me. Robots are not static entities. And this imagery does influence the narrative and the discussion. This influence of science fiction on our tendency to personify technology should not be disregarded. Science fiction is our way to see beyond the event horizon of now and to test out particular futures, but it can also shape public perceptions. So I'm collaborating on a particular project at the Lieberhume Centre for the Future of Intelligence on narratives of AI and looking at the repeating tropes. So some of you may be familiar with I, for one, welcome our new robot overlords is a meme that comes up occasionally. But older narratives and tropes such as King Midas, be careful what you wish for, or the Sorcerer's Apprentice, trying to take shortcuts with automation can lead to disaster. And then fears about robots taking over, Asimov stories, the narrative tropes in those appear again and again, or the idea of robots in charge, in the case of Robbie the robot there in the Oval Office, or eschatological religious tropes such as transhumanist ideas about the future of humanity. And since narratives around fear are so strong and prevalent, the question has to be asked then, do we necessarily fear our creations? Here's some examples of tweets with people discussing their fear of artificial intelligence. And of course, Frankenstein's monster, a very strong narrative trope in discussions about artificial intelligence. Well, there's two possible reasons for these narratives of fear. First, that we know we are fallible, and our hubris is often thought to be the primary failing in the mad scientist who works to create life through his own intellect, Frankenstein. And also, the child as an object has long held narrative power and employed in horror as a trope. The distance between ourselves and our creations, when our creation has a mind apparently of its own, is worrying. And that worry emerges in narratives around rebellion and the destruction of the master. And then second, kids are just bloody creepy. Horror has played on this idea again and again. That which comes from us but is not us can be disturbing and can cause fear and reactions. And you see this in science fiction and horror. And even further before that in folklore and religious thought, so in the myth of the changeling. The idea where spirits, either fey or demonic, replace good children with malevolent beings that terrify their parents. Now this makes sense if you've ever had children. They are irrational beings. I speak as a mother. If you have a small human that refuses to listen to logic or even just cries through the night, perhaps you would come up with some sort of storyline to explain why that would be. But it's assumed that artificial intelligence would at least be rational. But within that rationality and its strong aims towards a particular utilitarian outcome, there are assumptions that there could be mistakes made through a lack of common sense. So these fear narratives arise again and again. So this distance, a dealing with the other, an other that increasingly becomes independent of us, leads to recurring fears about our creations, whether we are their literal parents or metaphorical parents as creators, and also in our attempts at factual representations of the world. With our developing ideas about artificial intelligence, humanity is considering, and in the case of fictions like Westworld, dreaming about what kind of child it might have, and also what kind of parent we might be to that child. Thus, in 2001: A Space Odyssey, we're presented with a dystopic view of the relationship between the sixth crew member, Hal, and the humans aboard. But that is one particular narrative. The future of humans living with robots will not be such an easy binary of dystopic and utopian. It will be complicated and messy and will require us to think well in advance before we have these practical implications, as hopefully this evening's panel will be doing. Thank you very much.
Right. Hello. Hi. Oh, there's a strange feedback here. I think I should be here. I'm Hamad Haddadi. I'm a senior lecturer at Imperial. As said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical challenges that we are facing in developing things like machine learning applications and interacting with users who are actually using these systems. And actually, just in order to ease your mind a little bit, these are at the moment extremely dumb systems. A Go playing deep learning model that is playing Go and beating the world champion does not know that it's playing Go. It's just repeating a set of feed back and forth algorithms that it's been fed into and lots of data going into it. And that can be a problem, and you've probably seen these videos of robots going wrong, and that tells you, that kind of says a lot about where we are standing with robotics nowadays. So one of the things we are trying to really do technically is to try to bring a little bit of understanding and a little bit of contextual effort into the space of machine learning specifically. So I'm not covering AI as a whole, I'm specifically focusing on machine learning, by trying to put the user at the center of the ecosystem and developing and improving the system by using kind of the user as a guide to the system. So as an individual, you have more awareness of why this ad was shown to me and why is this camera chasing me across the whole web while I did already buy it on Amazon and the adverts are from Amazon and I clearly don't need another camera because I just spent £300 on a camera. And what can you do about this? So this kind of space is generally referred to as human data interaction, and it's mostly about these three main things. One of them is legibility. How can we give feedback to the individuals that this is an image, in your image you had I don't know, a pie, or you had a bunch of friends who had a bicycle, and that's why now on Facebook you're getting bicycle adverts. Or you're looking a little bit like you're suffering from hair loss, and now you're getting hair loss adverts, right? I get a lot of that. And then agency. I'm getting these ads, what can I do about it? Who do I complain to? And actually, despite the usual thing that you hear nowadays, that Facebook did this and Google, Facebook and Google are not actually the bad guys here. There are thousands and thousands of companies and agencies back there, collecting information about you across different websites, putting trackers on the web, playing all sorts of dirty replay tricks. Whenever you go on a website and there's a survey box coming up that do you want to take this survey, that survey is actually a recording mechanism for them to be able to actually then later on, for the duration of your use of that website, record how you're interacting with that website. So the survey doesn't finish when you've spent a minute of your life actually saying yes or no. The whole point is something else. And the negotiability. I've installed this app on my phone and it had access to, I don't know, 50 different data sources that were available on my phone. Maybe I do not need the Uber app to be taking screenshots of my phone while I'm not even using the app. Where do I go to turn off this setting? Who do I talk to? How do I negotiate with this system? If I'm installing a Nest thermostat in my home, or if I'm getting a smart meter because I've been forced to get one, how can I say, okay, fine, I'm going to get a thermostat, but I will give you daily aggregate of my smart meter usage. You don't necessarily need to know what TV channel I'm watching, because obviously watching an action movie and watching some sort of National Geographic has a completely different signature on your smart meter data. So, and then moving on from there, maybe we can have an actual healthy, innovative personal data ecosystem where, fine, you're hearing a lot about this new things that, how can we sell our data and whatever. No, we are not going to be able to evaluate how much our data is actually worth, because data of an individual in kind of bits and pieces is not valuable. The real value is from the model that is derived from putting it all together. But by installing a box on your car and now looking at your driving behavior, fine, I can probably say that, okay, I'm learning a lot about how 30 to 40-year-old males in West London are driving, and just in order to incentivize them, I will give them a 2% discount if they seem to be driving generally okay and not having any claims. But obviously, this is a zero-sum game. Insurance companies are not charities, so somebody else has to pay more, and that other person is usually the person who did not install a box. So there's the issue of digital inclusion here as well in the whole machine learning ecosystem. So I've mentioned personal data quite a few times. I'm talking about a range of data that either we generate as individuals, what you put on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, or from the sensors, which each of you has one of the best sensing mechanism in the world in your pocket now. It's got every sensor that is needed to really understand your lifestyle. And also all these conspiracies about, is Facebook constantly listening to my microphone? They don't really need to be recording your microphone 24/7 to understand what you're interested in. I mean, they have presence across a range of devices, across a range of services. They have the address book of you and all of your contacts, and whoever has ever uploaded their address book through WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook Messenger and Facebook app and stuff. So listening to conversation is probably not needed. Anyway, so I'm talking about a range of sensors here, right? There is useful elements here as well. So this is not, the AI is not just this horrible thing which is going to come, take over our life, stop our jobs and just kill us and just live in this world. Maybe it will eventually, but by that time we are probably not here, so who knows. And maybe that's just natural evolution, who knows again. But there are useful things here, right? Okay, it's useful to tell me that I've been sat at my desk for an hour and give me a bit of a tap on my hand that, oh, why don't you get up and walk for a minute? Maybe a useful functionality if I'm not planning to get early diabetes and early obesity. So, and then kind of ourselves, my team and myself and my PhD student, we are looking at a lot of applications using, for example, data that can improve individual and public health understanding. What's the correlation between posts that people put on Instagram and the chicken shops on my land and the obesity rate in that area, and how does the shopping trend depend on the time of day differ, and how do you then go and nudge those young kids who are buying fried chicken to buy something else? Maybe there's some benefit to that as well. But the problem to that, and especially around wearables, so this is where really a lot of machine learning effort is going in, to try and stick more sensors on you and around you and eventually in you. And you can already install, anyway, I'm going to move on immediately because I noticed there's recording happening. And actually, yeah, I'm sure you've heard in the news what kind of data has been recorded from wearables and what kind of conversation has been linking to these third-party data collectors. Anyway, so yeah, right, okay, so we can collect some data, look at, do some fancy machine learning from the accelerometer, see what activity people have been doing, and give them a bit of feedback that, okay, you've taken that many steps. Well, the problem today is that also all of these data sets and all of this different data that we have to train this huge brain that is kind of this doctor who's always by my side on my right shoulder, it's supposed to be, right? That is protecting me to tell me, do this and do that. But the problem is that these data are always currently always living in isolation. Now, how do I go about making value out of this data? Either let's just give everything in the world to Google. Give the NHS data to Google, give the DeepMind, whatever. And you heard all the DeepMind stories around this. So obviously this is not a solution. On the other hand, expecting an individual to run this kind of huge supercomputing thing and deep learning model at their end and collecting all their data and now being able to correlate between the sentiment of their tweets and the type of food that they had and the result of their increase in salary, in the expenditure that they had on their car insurance or health insurance, whatever, that's not also possible. So these are some of the other challenges that we are facing today, that how much analytics do we do, to what extent, where does this happen, how do we train this huge model which should be up there somewhere in the cloud? And I actually don't know what's that wiggly thing on top of my slides, but let's ignore that as well. Seems to be some squashed together Imperial College logo. Right, so this is one of the research agendas that a lot of us, most specifically within the engineering community and within the computer science community, are following. A little bit, unfortunately, disconnected from the other disciplines, and this is exactly where problems start to rise. John had an excellent article in The Guardian yesterday, actually, on this very topic, that why a lot of these systems are failing, because a bunch of geeks are developing something without broader understanding of the societal context, without understanding what happens when I just tune this model and I now run it live on Facebook, which is affecting over 1 billion people, right? Okay, they may not be all live profiles, but and then you see what problems they face, right? These AI, whatever this AI beast that we call, and it's affecting our elections and our car insurance prices and all of that. It partly comes from that as engineers, who hundreds of them are sitting maybe just around the corner in the DeepMind office or in any other discipline, we need to expand, and I'm really glad on events like this that enable dialogue across disciplines. So what's going on? There's a lot of effort, generally, a lot of machine learning effort on image recognition. Now that's basically the next step really that's coming on, understanding what is it that you're putting on Facebook and on Instagram, how can we make value out of it? Maybe at the moment the whole aim of the whole universe is to target ads, but eventually that will also, we will probably move on from that as well and probably get more intimate and more personal. And also more user studies is something that a lot of these companies are trying to do, and the users are unfortunately us as individuals. And that's it from me. So that was a bit of brief overview of the technical challenges. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening, folks. You may be interested to know I don't buy most of this crap. I think a certain amount of skepticism might be appropriate. My thinking about this is bracketed between three quotations. One is by William Gibson, which I'm sure you know, which says the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. The second is a quotation from Martin Heidegger. It is that that technology is the art of arranging the world so you don't have to experience it. And the third quotation is an adaptation by me of a slogan of the women's movement in the 70s, which was that the personal is political. And my adaptation of it says the technical is political. Now, if we go back to Gibson for a minute, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. The truth of the matter is that we already have, and we rely a lot on, so-called AI. That's a particular kind of AI, but nevertheless it is AI of the sort. So, for example, I guess everybody in this room has flown on an airliner. And 99% of the air miles flown by every airliner we fly in, not flown by a human being, they're flown by a set of algorithms, some of them intelligent. And our dependence on this kind of AI is increasing day by day. And there are 5 huge companies in the world now, all 5 of the most valuable companies in the world, all of them digital, and they plan to keep it that way. For example, if you watch the current chief executive of Google, you'll find him giving pious interviews saying that Google is now committed to what he says is AI everywhere in his products. He thinks that's a really good idea. Now, in terms of AI, it helps to make some distinctions about what we're talking about. Conventionally, people talk about weak AI. That is to say, essentially just a combination of big data and this amazing new engineering drug called machine learning. And then there's strong AI, which is variously kind of described as artificial general intelligence, or sometimes superintelligence, that is to say, some kind of artificial intelligence which has human-level capabilities. And at the moment, there's a very interesting, largely fatuous debate about this superintelligence. And eminent people who ought to know better, like, for example, Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk, appear to be taking it seriously. I don't take it seriously, and I don't know anybody working in the field who does. There's one famous AI specialist has said once that he worried about superintelligence in the same way that he worries about overpopulation on Mars. And I think he's right. But then you have to ask that what function does this obsession with superintelligence play? And one cynical interpretation is that it serves the useful purpose of obscuring, useful from the company's point of view, of obscuring what's actually going on. And what's actually going on is the rapid penetration of weak AI. This is this combination of machine learning and big data into every crevice of human existence. I think machine learning is a very interesting technology, and it has engineers are fascinated by certain kinds of things. I'm an engineer, so I can say this, in the way that small children are fascinated by glittery things. But machine learning often, when you look at it critically, is a sort of embodiment of a crippled epistemology. It's the idea that if you feed quite a lot of data of some kind into an algorithm, then what you get is knowledge. And that's complete baloney. You get things out of it, of course, and sometimes it's useful, especially for commercial purposes. It's very useful for Amazon or Netflix to be able to guess accurately what you might like to buy next or watch next. But that's sort of, that's pathetic and criminal. It's ridiculous for grown human beings to be excited by this crap. It's simply astonishing. There you go. Now, the real question about this stuff, in my opinion, is not whether the technology is wonderful or capable of being wonderful, because often it is. you can think of this stuff as power steering for the mind. If you wanted a crude analogy at the moment, those of you who are motorists may have cars fitted with sat-navs. And sat-navs are generally quite useful. Well, that's the kind of thing that, as a metaphor, we would ideally like from this technology. We'd like it to be power steering for our minds. And the big question from my point of view in relation to this particular event is a very old Latin question. Cui bono? Who benefits from this stuff? And my answer is that if we go on as we're going, the answer will be the ones who benefit most will be 5 huge companies who have mastered and controlled this technology. So we'll have, in a sense, a rerun on steroids of what we already have. How many people here use Facebook? Okay. Well, you will know as Facebook users that you are actually digital sharecroppers. That Facebook is a digital sharecropper. You are the unfortunate peasants who do all the work. And you don't get anything out of it in terms of monetary value, but Facebook does. Now, I think that's what we'll get with AI if it runs to that sort of formula. Except that this time, what will happen is that it will not just be our attention that is hijacked, because that's what's happening with Facebook. The average time spent on Facebook, or the average time spent on Facebook by 1 billion people a day is 50 minutes. And that's hijacking our attention, because there's only so much. Attention is a finite resource. You have to sleep, you have to eat, you have to work, and you really have to spend 50 minutes on Facebook. But next time round, it will be our employment, and it will be the benefits that therefore flow from having a place in society, having work, and so on. And just coincidentally, there's a couple of very interesting coincidences that we have observed, but we don't talk about much in the last decade and a half. First of all, we've had the exponential growth of this tech industry, and we also have it combined with accelerating social inequality. Isn't that strange? And secondly, we have a growing dependence on weak AI, and it looks as though we have increasingly authoritarian politics. Could these just be coincidences, random correlations, or not? Okay, second quote, Heidegger. Technology is the art of arranging the world so we don't have to experience it. What we actually need, I would say, from this technology is human intelligence augmented. In other words, IA, rather like power steering for the mind, using that metaphor. Not human intelligence that's replaced by an artificial variety. So we need IA, not AI. Now, how would we make sure that we get there? Well, the answer to that is political. Because in the end, the only thing that will make this happen is political and democratic control of 5 corporations who are currently running berserk. That's why I say, go back to the women's slogan of the 70s, the technical is political. If you have been, thank you for listening.
I've been asked to give you a sort of an update or a sort of a story and headline as to what the privacy implications are of AI. I'm a solicitor in private practice. I'm advising both big ugly corporations who are data controllers, and I'm advising individuals who are you and me data subjects. I realise I'm an average Facebook user. I use it without measuring it precisely about 50 minutes a day probably. I use Twitter regularly. I find I sit on the 6th floor of my building, and if I get the lift up or down, I can generally roughly catch up with, so if I don't like Twitter now that they've doubled the length, I can't read as many tweets, but I can tweet out something if it interests me. So my output on Twitter depends on how many times I go up and down in the lift each day generally. Okay, thank you. So privacy is a fundamental human right. The European Declaration European Human Rights Convention, Article 8, sets out very clearly that everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home and his correspondence, and I apologise for the non-gender inclusive language of the document, but nonetheless you can see that that is a fundamental human right, and therefore all of us have that, irrespective of anything else. And that's a very good starting point. The law has then developed somewhat from there. We had in 1984, we had a UK Data Protection Act, which gave individuals rights. So 1984, if you think when you first got a computer of any description, it certainly wasn't, I'd imagine, 1984. Maybe by the early 90s, some of you would have been alive, but some of you would have had a computer on your desk if you were in offices. Certainly you wouldn't have had a mobile phone by then. And the Data Protection Directive was passed by the EU in 1995, which hadn't yet caught up with the fact that technology was growing apace. The UK implemented that directive into UK law in 98, and about 20 years later, 15, 16 years later, Europe looked at it again and said, this is not quite keeping up with reality, we need to update them more. We've got the Data Protection Act in the UK, and we've got 27 other versions of it dotted around Europe. Let's try and create what they always call a level playing field, a single market in data. Let's have a new piece of law that will apply across Europe, and that was the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which is an acronym that many of you would have heard of. GDPR was passed last year, and it automatically becomes law across the European Union in May next year. The UK has decided that because, I'll give away my colours here, because of this pretense that we're going to Brexit, I don't think we will. You heard it here first. Cameron, that's a disaster. But the UK government has decided what it needs to do is implement that regulation into UK law, and it's got this data protection bill that started going through Parliament. It's going through the House of Lords at the moment. And that brings into UK law GDPR, and it brings into UK law certain gaps that GDPR says member states can do. And then, let's say we Brexit in March 19, we will have our own Data Protection Act 2018, probably. All of that gives people these fundamental rights. So that's the front page of the bill, and it is, you'll see, Section 1.1, or Clause 1.1 as it now is, this Act makes provision about the processing of personal data. Most processing is subject to the GDPR. So it says, effectively, this is a piece of law relating to personal data, and personal data is what it's all about, data relating to each of you, to me, as John said earlier, it's what big ugly corporates are gathering about us, but big ugly states are gathering about us, and some quite attractive smaller companies and businesses are collecting about us. So where does AI, artificial intelligence, fit into this? Well, the EU's data protection supervisor, who's the sort of regulator responsible, the sort of the chief civil servant responsible for this sort of thing, has recognised that artificial intelligence is a reality. He says it's woven its way into everyday life, and they give various examples: navigation systems we've heard of, spam filters, weather forecasts, all types of AI. Of course, all of that is nothing compared to even the simple examples that Hamid gave of a whole bunch of things that are going on, that personal data is being collected about us. And part of the problem with the law is always behind the technology, and it might be argued the technology is always behind where we think we're heading as well. But nonetheless, there's clearly been significant advances in machine learning in the space of AI, and I'm sort of like a number of the speakers have talked about machine learning here as a subset of AI effectively, where algorithms analyze huge data sets. I think we recognise big data, business recognises big data as a good. It sort of often recognises even bigger data as inevitably therefore even better, and it's developed algorithms that can analyse that data really clearly to pull out and extract whether it is predictive data about what pair of shoes you're going to buy next based on your browsing habits, or cleverer things, and it makes predictions. And as a result of this system, it's a sort of a give and take. The more you give up your data, the more the system takes, and the bigger this data set becomes. And it's collecting all sorts of data, and monitoring all sorts of data about human behaviour, all of which, of course, do present challenges to privacy. I thought I would just see what the UK Information Commissioner has been doing. The UK Information Commissioner is the regulator in the UK for data, for looking after privacy. And there's a government, or in fact select committee on artificial intelligence called for papers and submissions earlier this year, and in September the Information Commissioner submitted a 50-page, 40-page document recognising there's a rapid increase in use of AI, although a type of automated processing presents its own unique risks, whereas traditional processing involves a human being making decisions as to how and for what purpose data is processed. AI-enabled processing involves a computer making these decisions with little or no human oversight. And I'm going to come back to that little or no human oversight, because I think that is a fundamental difference in privacy law between where we have been before all of this and where we are now. So if you go back to the 1984 Data Protection Act, computers weren't really doing what they're doing now, and that was sort of the early days of this. In fact, recent UK research, and I was amused, I can't remember, one of you mentioned this word, I think it was Beth, you mentioned it. Recent UK research found that 55% of UK consumers find AI creepy. That's not a technical legal term, but I suspect we all agree that it's always a bit worrying when Facebook or LinkedIn seem to know what you're thinking before you realise you've thought it. But that's the clever stuff. Data protection law really has as its basis the idea that there's a human intervention, that people in some way have some say over what's happening to their data and understand what's happening to their data. And obviously with AI and machine learning, we sort of moved away from that direct relationship between me and my data and you, the big ugly company, big ugly state, knowing what you're doing, whether it's CCTV or shopping habits or however you want to look at it. So I thought, how can I bring this in terms of what's going on out there? And I sort of thought, let's think of a self-driving car. This is an image I think I picked up from The Economist. I think somewhere down here it says source The Economist. But you can see it's sort of collecting a huge amount of data, and I realised actually it's too complicated, so I stuck with credit cards instead. Machine learning technology obviously enables the bank, the lender, the credit card company to work out a huge amount about me, where I spend my money, how I spend it. Do I spend it in big amounts, small amounts, what time of month, and so on, and can make a profile of me, test me against another set of data about other sorts of people who I seem to look like, and based on that classification can make decisions about me. There was, I think, a report only this morning or yesterday morning about poorer people having their credit limits raised by credit card companies. So these are people who already can't afford to pay things based on their current income, being encouraged, I suppose, to borrow more based on an increased credit card number that they're being given, and all of that's being done automatically by computers. So the privacy point. All of this sort of profiling can have an intrusive impact. It might be doing things which are not within reasonable expectations of people, and certainly it's not always transparent. And I think the guiding principle of data protection law has always been about telling people what you're going to do with their data and then doing that. And if there's a sort of a principle that you take away with you about what's the law all about, it is about transparency. The law assumes that you will tell people what you're doing and then do that. And it's as simple as that. But of course, AI and machine learning and all these sorts of things are so complex and too complicated to explain to a normal person. In fact, I suspect with all the doctors and professors sitting alongside me here, too complex to explain to them exactly what's going on when my credit card decides to increase my credit balance, just like that, apparently. So this idea of transparency is being eroded by AI. Whilst we benefit from AI, and we've seen a whole bunch of clever stuff going on, and as I say, I'm a user of it and I love it. On the other hand, I can see how there's a disconnect there. I just sort of thought, why not? And I'm sure nobody else would mention it. So, I think the privacy implications are numerous. How do you know what data they're collecting? How do you know if it's accurate? What can you do about that? How can you fix it? An AI project collects data, analyzes it, applies outcomes, all based on a series of algorithms that we cannot understand and don't understand what's going on, and the results might impact upon me, and I might be measured against a class of people or even measured against some activity that I've been undertaking, and I can't really assess whether that's fair or not. There are undoubtedly hidden biases, will be built in, often which derive from an initial human creation. So the upshot from a privacy perspective is there's an awful lot of data being collected about us. Organisations are collecting this without necessarily being transparent and clear as to what they're doing with it. It can have an impact on us, and all of that is technically against the law. The law is very clear. The practice is technically probably not in compliance with the law, and the challenge for lawyers, for enforcement agencies, is how do you enforce human rights in that context? Thank you.
Thank you all for enormously interesting presentations, which I'm now going to try and summarise and add my own thoughts to. Bear with me if I don't succeed in doing that very well. First of all, Dr. Singler, Beth, told us all about the sixth member of the crew, and that they've all inevitably are a case of AI gone bad, that Hal's reaction in 2001 was a pretty serious issue where he went off and killed all the crew, and I'm inclined to agree. She talked about the personality of AI, about the fears of future relationships, of the automation of our lives, of the slave-master, not collaborator issue. And it made me think, actually, a little of the tweets that went out a couple of days ago about the robot doing gymnastics, and somebody basically went, oh, well, that's all buggered. You can't use those words, they're my words. And then everybody went, oh yeah, shit, oh no, there's a robot doing gymnastics. And then everybody else went, yeah, it's a robot doing gymnastics, so what are you all worrying about? Unless you're a gymnast, it's not going to take your job. And I think that that's a really interesting point, actually, because we are all worrying, but what are we actually worrying about? And that was absolutely the point of part of Beth's presentation. I very much like the idea of that which comes from us is not us. And I've been reading an awful lot today about the fact that we are building AI, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And this comes up actually in later presentations. But with the word dumb, smart technology is only smart when we've told it everything we know. It starts off dumb, it's us that makes it clever. And I've also spent quite a lot of time thinking about, if any of you have read the book The Righteous Mind, and the idea of weird, which I don't have written down with me, but it's about being Western, being educated, being democratic, etc. And you could argue that the majority of people within the 5 big companies that were referred to in one of the presentations are actually fit that category, that we are all being steered by AI built on the west coast of America with ideals that certainly don't necessarily suit the rest of the world, which is now connected and allegedly living in the same way. So I think this is something that certainly, had I been asked to give a presentation, I probably would have blathered on quite a lot about. But that's just a brief aside. So Beth also talks about how the future won't be a simple debate between dystopia and utopia, and I'm kind of glad about that. I don't think black-white really works. It's all about grey, but it's about how we navigate our fear and the narratives through it. And certainly the idea of data control and data ownership, I wrote, was this possible, and that comes up in a number of the later presentations. So then we had the presentation by Dr. Hadidi, and he basically described what I try and tell people to do, but in far better, more technical and more engineering precise language. That idea of the individual being the data citizen. I speak an awful lot in my line of work at Big Brother Watchers about people being digital citizens and trying to get everybody to understand that they are now their data. We hear an awful lot about data being oil, but I argue that data is now actually as critical to us as our flesh and blood, and that if we don't learn to look after it, we will be exploited. But equally, if governments don't learn to understand that our data, and keeping our data private and secure is part of our security, part of protecting society, then we're going to head down a very interesting road. And I raised that point about the issue of encryption. Government's keen to allow encryption to be broken to deal with issues relating to terrorism, but on the flip side telling us that encryption is really critical to keep us safe from cyber crime and cyber warfare. I think that issue of data now being integral to who we are and what we do and how we live isn't something that yet filtered down into the politics, which is obviously something that John spoke about. Back to Dr. Hadidi's point about, he talked to us about legibility, about how we need to reflect on how our data is being used and why, about agency, what we can do about it and who we can complain to, and that certainly overlaps with Adam's points about law and GDPR. And talked, quite interesting, you mentioned about Facebook and Google not being the bad guys, and talked about these other, I call them data brokers, and that's whatever you call them, who actually are the invisible people, the invisible companies who are behind Facebook and Google and Twitter. I regularly try and explain this by imagining the digital world and the physical world. If you go into a shop to make a purchase, you have an engagement with the person behind the till. The only person, if you're paying in cash, who knows about this engagement is you and them and the cash in your hand. If you use your credit card or debit card or a store card, then obviously that company too. We think we have exactly the same engagement when we're online, that when we make a purchase with Amazon, the only people knowing about that purchase are us and Amazon. We don't see the hidden masses behind the scenes who are all these data brokers standing there, effectively, writing down who we are, what we look like, what we're wearing, what we're buying, what our conversation was, literally interrogating every aspect of our engagement. And if we could see that, if that was the actual engagement we had in the physical world, we'd probably never leave the house. We would probably never go and buy anything because we'd be so fretful about who was gathering up all this information. I think we really do need to start seeing data as a physical thing, and only then can we actually properly interact with it in the way that I would say the work you're doing is steering us towards. Also, I thought it was very interesting that the point about privacy is actually costly. If you don't want to have the black box in your car to get the better, so that your insurance company knows how you drive, then you pay a penalty for it. If you don't want to register your Oyster card because you don't want TfL knowing everywhere you go, then you pay more money for it. I personally object very profoundly to this idea that your privacy should cost you more. And I also like your thought that they don't need a microphone to actually listen in to us, they know everything anyway. Well, yes, and I'm actually personally quite curious about this because I get a lot of people phoning me saying, I don't understand what's going on. Instagram I was talking about this burger place I've been to dinner at the night before that I hadn't told anybody about, and all of a sudden I've had all these adverts, and I'd really like to know. I'm pretty sure they probably are listening in, but maybe that's me being nervous. But you're right, they do need to know everything about us, and that's because we tell them everything about us. Now, your point about AI being useful, the idea of having a wearable and it telling you you've been sat at your desk for too long and get up and have a walk, well, yes, that does have its benefits, but are we not therefore permitting the nanny state? And you used, for me, the worst word of all, which is nudge. I worry very profoundly, another one of my many worries, how do I sleep at night, about nudge theory, and that certainly UK politics, Cabinet Office, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, with their data protection and their data sharing approach, seem to base everything around the idea of nudge. Give us your data, we'll look after it, you stay at arm's length from it, but we're doing all of this for your well-being. And I think the sooner we wake up to the idea that well-being is a very broad, potentially vacuous term, and that actually being kept at arm's length from our data isn't something that's beneficial for us, the better. Personal niggle, and I know this is being filmed, but I'm going to say it anyway. Our digital minister, Matthew Hancock, said at the end of the Digital Economy Act, at the point that it was being put into law, he was asked by Chion Warra from the Labour Party, can you tell us now, after all of the debate and discussion about Digital Economy Act, do citizens own and control their own data? He knew the answer was no, because he fought so hard for it to be no. His response was, citizens get to choose who they vote for and who represents them here. Anything anyone can do to challenge Matthew Hancock, I'll be very grateful, because I've been trying and I need a few more people behind me. Anyway, there were some enormously fascinating points that I'm now expanding upon, and you ended, Dr. Hadidi, on the issue of image recognition being the next step, and that targeted ads are just the first step in this, but it's all likely to become more personal, and I suspect you're right, and another one of my list of worries. Then John spoke, and he told us he was sceptical about it all, and that's good. I'm very relieved about that. And he gave us 3 quotes, of which I managed to write down 2, but missed out probably the most important one of all in the middle. He quoted William Gibson and said that the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. He quoted Heidegger, which I didn't write down, and he told us that he had adapted the view that the personal is political to the technical is political. He then went on to talk about the 5 biggest, most powerful companies, and talked about weak AI and strong AI, which I think is a super brilliant way of being able to explain this issue of big data and machine learning, but then the issue of artificial intelligence with super intelligence and human capabilities. Now, I find it very interesting that John says he doesn't take the super intelligence seriously, and that it's like worrying about overpopulation on Mars, and that actually it obscures what's actually going on, which is that weak AI is already in every crevice of human existence, and I think all the presentations have made that abundantly clear. I very much enjoy the idea of power steering for the mind. There are a number of books out at the moment of people talking about how actually the amount of time we are dedicating to the online world is actually really damaging all of us. And I think there's a genuine push towards the idea of critical thinking and teaching critical thinking in schools. And I hope that this move towards trying to understand how to get people to put down the screen, read a book, challenge what they're saying, will start to have impact, particularly with the issues we've experienced recently with regards to fake news, with regards to impacts on the democratic system, but more broadly, when we do start moving away from typing everything, but merely barking an order at Alexa or Siri. I think we do need to definitely step back and consider how the challenges that we've experienced in the physical world don't always overlap in the digital world, but we need to think about how we can see mirroring and how we can teach children a better approach. And then finally, we come to Adam and privacy implications, and Adam gave us a whistle-stop tour through data protection law and talked a lot about the GDPR, which you all need to be aware of, because the GDPR isn't just about how companies engage with you. There are 7 data protection rights you have in the GDPR. If you want to know what they all are, you can go to Big Brother Watch website. We have a useful handy fact sheet for each one of them. But you need to know what your data protection rights are, because if you don't know them and you don't learn them, you're not going to use them. And when challenged, we hear 55% of people say that this is creepy. There are things you can do. You do have the right to be forgotten. You do have the right to challenge. You do have the right to rectification, which means if there is data out there about you that's inaccurate, you can go to the organisation and you can say that data's wrong, and you can amend it, and you can make sure that it's right. So there are powers there now for you. But I thought it was very interesting, Adam, that you said that all of the issues, the intrusiveness, the transparency, the lack of transparency, the complexity of how our data is used, the accuracy of our data, the hidden bias in our data, and the decisions being made by machines, not by humans, are all against the law. Unfortunately, the law is now being written to make them not against the law as such, but that there's a law that means, as I said, you do have some recourse to be able to handle this. I very much enjoyed the fact that you said self-driving cars are too complicated and went for credit cards. Self-driving cars are the future. Connected cars are the present. And talking about data, I think you could have easily stuck with a connected car and shown that you're now driving a computer on wheels, and that that computer on wheels is listening to what you do and where you go, and it is sharing that with Google and Yelp and insurance companies, and that one personal experience of getting in your car and going for a drive being an escape from something, you are now just as latched into the internet as you are when you're on your mobile phone or when you're searching Google. So, I've rattled on. I hope I've done a decent summary of what was discussed. I think really I've chipped in with a few thoughts. My personal view is that we seem to be actively seeking a relationship with AI. In fact, we're actively inviting it into our homes. And I had a conversation just before this started with Adam about being a citizen and about being a consumer. But I would argue there's now a third way, and that is that we are the product. Before, you would buy a piece of technology, it would be an inanimate object, it would sit in your house, you would have engagement with it, but it didn't engage back with you. But now you spend thousands of pounds on very nifty bits of kit that actually continue to take from you, that take more. It used to be if something was free, it was your data paying for it. Well, now you're paying for the product and you're giving your data. So I think we should all sit and think about what choices do we want to make, how do we want our relationship with AI to be. It's not going away, it's only going to get greater, and I look forward to all the questions challenging all of the points that have been made today. Thank you.